Greetings. Okay, I think we can get started pretty soon. First, I just wanted to open the floor if you all have any thoughts on the current political moment. Um, anything from what's happening on like left-wing social media to Elon Musk as a Nazi to the Trump situation. Seems to me like the Trump situation is in a weird dynamic, like um some kind of like very like awkward repetition of 2016 feels like it's happening once again. As if like we don't have the institutional power to learn or to like modify any like wide scale strategic like I would even say in a weird way perhaps our infrastructure on the left is like weaker even than it was in 2016 because at least in 2016 we didn't know what was actually going to happen. So there, I think that lack of knowledge about how monstrous Trump would be or how soft he would be was unclear. And so now we're in a bit of like a whiplash. Um, and the other weird thing is that he seems to, according to the pundits, have some kind of like popular mandate for his policies. And the fact, speaking of class struggle, the fact that he seems to have convinced the commentariat that he owns the working class is something that deeply, deeply frustrates me. So yeah, I would just wanted to open the floor to that. Like I know I'm slightly breaking from our tradition. I don't have too many opening remarks on these final two chapters. I liked them. I will say I felt that the Simone Weil chapter or section towards the in chapter 13 towards the end, which you guys probably read, Losurdo likes to like populism as a category is doing a lot of work for Losurdo, and I feel that he lumps maybe too many tendencies into populism, right? So, in other words, like sometimes populism is synonymous with utopian socialism. And I felt that at times Losurdo's treatment of populism loses the actual granularity of how confused populism actually is as a kind of lived ideological construct in our time. In other words, he sometimes refers to populism as a deviation from Marxism, which I think, of course, it is, but it's a bit of an overreach in some cases. In some cases, I feel that that's the case. What I really liked about these final two chapters, though, was how Losurdo treated the inadequacy of recognition struggles. So that comes back, and that's been a huge motif, obviously, that we've looked at and tracked for well, it's huge within Western Marxism, and it's huge here. And I would say, um, for Losurdo's liberal critics, or for like Losurdo's Marxist and liberal critics, one of the things that this book has convinced me of, if they were to give it a charitable reading, is the sense in which he offers a more robust rebuttal to what everyone on the left wants to rebuke, which is identity politics and a kind of like faux progressivism or a faux intersectionalism, right? So that is very noble, I think, on Losurdo's part. And how he does that here is by allowing us to incorporate a conception of emancipation that is in line with the seizing of the means of production in a way that's unabashed. And why he spends so much time on Hannah Arendt and Simone Weil is precisely because they conceive of class categories as completely detethered from production. In the case of Hannah Arendt, she thinks the technology basically overrides class struggle, right? So there's a weird dynamic happening in the kind of neoliberal era, according to Losurdo, and I think he's right about this, which is that you have a new class reemerge onto the historical scene, concurrent to the end of ideologies, and that class is the working poor. And the working poor, there's been an ambiguity about this, right? The working poor has returned with a vengeance, particularly in the 1990s, right? And the ambiguity is that all of the kind of theoretical models of class struggle and emancipation and disemancipation, when we take the Arendt or the Habermas or this idea of Nancy Fraser of recognition struggles, what we find is that they do not address the economic substratum of the exploitation of the working poor. And so there's like a radical disconnect of contemporary left-wing left-wing theory regarding how to deal with the return of the working poor. So I felt that that's very, very apt. But what Losurdo misses, and perhaps because the text is slightly dated, is the Corbyn and Sanders assault on populism, and therefore the Corbyn and Sanders redefinition, or the post 2008 redefinition of populism as economic populism, right? So that would have provided for, I think, a much richer conversation if we were to include all of that in there. Um, I'll leave the conversation of Losurdo's treatment of contemporary China and class struggle to other comrades. Like I know Conrad is based in China and probably has more insights. And I really want to hear from Aaron because Aaron is a specialist in populism. So I want to hear your thoughts on the populism piece. I invite folks to weigh in on Hannah Arendt. It is very accurate, by the way, to criticize Hannah Arendt because in a certain way, she's a bit like Nietzsche in the sense that she gets on the inside of Marxist categories. For example, in her book on the human condition, um, she revises the Marxist theory of praxis by literally excising any commitment to class struggle. And I feel that obviously Nietzsche does that. If you read Lukács's criticism of Nietzsche and Destruction of Reason, that's kind of like remember Lukács's formula for Nietzsche, which is never before have we seen a more thorough and a more total and a more systematic rebuttal of Marxism than in Nietzsche. And I think that in a certain way, Hannah Arendt is also sort of parasitizing Marxism in a certain way, and that is pernicious. And I even, in my debate with Chris Catrone, I got him to admit that that is pernicious. And so I said, so you agree with Losurdo? And then, of course, I told him that thing that, because he loves generations, I said, yeah, well, all of the young people that like Losurdo tend to be from working poor backgrounds. What do you have to say to that? Anyways, I might be able to release that debate at some point in the future. But those are some opening comments. There's been a lot of drama with my internet life regarding the crisis of this thing called the American Communist Party. So I'm happy to take any questions that people have or comments. Unfortunately, I've been thrown in the middle of a very high profile possible dissolution of a communist organization, and it hasn't been too pretty. To be honest with you, it has not been too pretty. But yeah, I'm dealing with it. And what's up, Andrew?
Hey Daniel, hey everybody. Hope you're all doing well. Yeah, I had some sort of some comments and questions concerning the text in regards to the first chapter, chapter 12. I
Yeah.
really want to address the stuff that he has to criticize on Hannah Arendt because it seems like, well, one, as you pointed out, like she privileges technological production as
Hmm.
something that drives society forward, and it seems like from what I read, she not only, as he says, de-radicalizes terms like working class and exploitation, but even puts exploitation and poverty to the sort of forces of nature, right? And with this with this aspect of like poverty being something of nature, the working class can't, lead any sort of emancipation. It's only those that are free thinking individuals, and poverty is something that keeps anybody from being a free minded individual or free thinking individual. But I really like what he says when he criticizes her use of technology, because he makes that example. I forget when it was or what country it was, but it has to do with like some pesticide um, that sort of leaked out, and then it caused a sort of ecological disaster. And he says that this example shows not only the failures of Hannah Arendt's like fetishism of technology, but also puts into question the use of technological machinery and the capitalist intentions of it. So I thought that was really interesting. And my second
Yeah.
thing I wanted to ask is if you could elaborate more on your point regarding the multiplicities of class struggles, as he says later on in that chapter,
Hmm.
and the sort of struggle for recognition. Because when he gets into I think it's the part concerning Nancy Fraser, he says that like the theories of recognition persist in a new light in the form of the women's movement. And he also points out how
Yes.
there's a disharmony between
Yeah.
um, class struggle as like worker struggle and the struggle for recognition. Like they both exist, but they're not
Right.
in this sort of harmonious manner,
Yeah.
right? They've always been sort of disharmonious, but it doesn't mean they're like asymmetrical. It just means that they're constantly evolving.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it's kind of why if you turn on NPR, it's impossible to listen to liberals anymore. And it's also like from a rhetorical standpoint, like I think that Fukuyama, like in a paradoxical way, the narrative of the end of history is also the narrative of the end of ideologies. And so you see Losurdo's contribution is to offer a correction, and this is where multiplicity of struggles I think comes into play regarding the dehistoricized basis by which a lot of contemporary left-wing theorists understand recognition struggles as anti-Marxist, but also perhaps as anti-revolutionary or not in line with the emancipatory tradition, because the emancipatory tradition becomes the site also of the self-justification of their paradigm or the logic of their paradigm. And so there's a kind of ahistoricism going on that he wants to reinitiate, which is why he's making all of these references to the centrality of the women's struggle, not only in 1917, but even back in the Second International. And I thought those were all very sound and very excellent to add there. I mean, regarding Hannah Arendt and her almost like uh, theological support for the intervention of technology as a remediative device, I actually saw some echoes of that same optimism in technology as we see in, like, say, left accelerationism, for example. I see that same idea, or even like, why was it that fully automated luxury communism was supported by, even was uncritical of UBI, for example, right? So there's this sort of poor, um, there's like two things going on, I think, with this fetishization of technology. On the one hand, it um, leaves the condition of the working class in a praxeological or like a practical no man's land, because it casts major aspersions of doubt on the possibility of emancipation based in the historical tradition of the workers' movement. So, in other words, what I hear him saying is that both in Habermas, to some extent in Fraser and Arendt, and maybe we could list many other postmodern theories, almost to say that like the kind of core of their logic is also based on a kind of criticism of the inadequacies of forms of emancipation in the revolutionary and the Marxist tradition. So I would argue that that is very, very, very sound and has been extremely damaging. And it's one of the reasons why, even though Losurdo is known as a great critic of liberalism, you have to always understand, I feel, that even in his book on liberalism, um, so much of that is, and you really see it in the polemical style of his writing in this book. So much of that is, like, say, for example, the pages that he writes on Zizek. I mean, I can see why Slavoj wouldn't see it necessary to respond to Losurdo on, because he doesn't. I've asked him about it. And I think the reason is because he perceives Zizek to, or right, Zizek perceives Losurdo to be making almost like a kind of arbitrary analogy regarding the wider theory of emancipation that Zizek holds dear. This was like his whole criticism of why is it that the model of emancipation, of recognition in its pure form that we get from the Haitian slave revolt, why is it? And we don't, and of course, Losurdo, another reason Zizek doesn't respond to Losurdo is precisely because um, Losurdo is criticizing him purely at a historicist point of view, not at a theoretical point of view. But at a theoretical point of view, Zizek is trying to say that that model of emancipation, of recognition, and so on is dead. So, in a certain sense, Zizek sort of wants to have his cake and eat it too regarding the end of ideologies. And I feel that Losurdo is almost opening up like a, you might say, like a broader historical horizon and pointing to a form of emancipatory tradition that is still alive, perhaps. So those are some original thoughts, or immediate thoughts, rather, on what you said, Andrew. But I don't want to talk too much more and go to Conrad.
Okay, thank you. Good to be here and to have concluded this text. Um, you started off talking about Trump, um, and it occurred to me while you were speaking that I think that Marx already captured, in a sense, very well this phenomenon with his famous dictum that first is tragedy, then is farce, right? All great world historical events need to repeat twice, right, in order to be affirmed, right? So Napoleon, for example, occurred twice. So I think that, we're seeing this, tremendous disillusionment or perhaps fervor in some circles because um, people really feel at this point that Trump has arrived, right? That he has a mandate, right? That he has the capacity and the support behind him to make these kind of changes. I think at the same time, that uh, repetition, if you will, attests to the clear failure of the left, conceived broadly and generically, to adapt to the outcome of 2016, to sufficiently adapt its strategy. And of course, we know the socialist left has faced all kinds of obstructions in that respect. But even at this date, right, we see that, there is not, I mean, there's been some acknowledgement, even by mainstream orgs, of, in a sense, perhaps the partial correctness of some of the things that were being advocated by Sanders or by people who are more far left. I think that's quite funny, that sort of belated acknowledgement. But then at the same time, you have people like, our friend, of course, Acid Horizon, talking about how, we need a revival of the wokeness of 2020. So not enough learning from experience in that sense. Um, but regarding Losurdo, you made a few different points. And I wanted to share something, and I think it's quite related to what we're talking about. But right now, I'm actually doing an interview with Roberto Finelli, who is a Marxist philosopher from Italy, longtime professor at Roma Tre, and he wrote a few books that deal with the way that Marx sort of develops his original thought, initially through a kind of artificial divorce, right, or improperly conceived divorce from Hegel that occurs via Feuerbach. And then how he finally sort of surmounts Hegel by reabsorbing him, right? And developing a more complex system in his advanced work. So I won't elaborate that too much, but he had a very long rapport with Losurdo. And I thought it was interesting because I'm doing an interview with him now, of course, and I thought it was interesting some of the points he made. Um, so in the interview, you were talking about how a lot of the people who seem to like Losurdo, they come from what you termed the working poor, right? And in the interview, it was interesting because Finelli was talking about how he and Losurdo, share a commonness in their origins, right? Because they both have a kind of Southern heritage, right? I think that Finelli's family is from near Avellino, and I think that Losurdo's family is from Puglia. But he was relating some of his work to the severity of the underdevelopment that was experienced in southern Italy and that would have been known to their generation. And he said that I think one thing that people neglect about Losurdo is that in a certain sense, his distance from Western Marxism, as it's commonly conceived, is also a distance from the material conditions or the affluent material conditions that we typically associate with the West, right? So the significance that he places on the thematic of development, right? In the movement of the productive forces, and all of this are somehow imminent to the situation of Southern Italy in that time. And he talks a little bit about his difference with this because he says that he thinks in comparison with Losurdo, he was more skeptical, about the licensing of a sort of neutral conception of the productive forces or sort of top-down party-led state as a means of achieving development. But he also talks a little bit about his use of Hegel's theme of recognition. And unlike, many Italian thinkers associated with post-operismo, for example, neither Finelli nor Losurdo rejected Hegel, right? They were both Hegelians in a sense. But he discusses his book on Hegel, and the argument of Finelli, and I'm not saying that I fully agree with this, but it's interesting. The argument of Finelli is that what's interesting if you look at Losurdo's study of Hegel is it focuses very strongly on the philosophy of right. And he argues that he kind of works primarily off the analysis of like the system of needs and the relation to civil society in the philosophy of right.
Right.
But that in a way for him, what's like, his conception of recognition ends up being quite gritty and material in a sense. And he argues that what's lost in this partly, is the higher thematics of recognition that we find within, the phenomenology of spirit and the logic with respect to human dignity and so forth. So he's relating this back to the fundamental way that he perceives Marxism. But I think what he identifies in common with his work and that of Losurdo, and this gets us to the theme of, if you look at operismo and post-operismo, in a certain sense, there was a refusal, right, of the actual complexity and contradictory nature of global society, right? So we see Tronti like really, really narrowing in, right, on like the worker strikes that were going in Italy in the 1960s, for example, and really, trying to make them into this privileged agency that's going to overcome all else, right?
Mm.
And I think at one point in Tronti says, the worker strikes that we've seen in the 60s in Italy are more important than all of the post-colonial struggles or all the anti-colonial struggles that we've seen in recent years, which is like just so ridiculous, right, as a claim. And we see a similar impulse within post-operismo. I mean, the kind of compulsion to anoint a sort of privileged class.
Mm.
But this, so that pertains to this sort of avoidance of contradiction. But I think it's related to the theme of populism as well. Because if I understand Losurdo's critique well, part of what he's doing is he's rejecting any analysis according to which, a class could, absent the sufficient mediation of contradiction, a class or group, absent the sufficient mediation of contradiction, could in itself, right, serve as a privileged agency, which is simply going to deliver political results
Right.
in that way. And I don't think, it's interesting because you were talking about the shift to economic populism, but I don't think that this is completely irrelevant to that standpoint. Because I think one thing that we see that would have been characteristic of economic populism and problematic about the economic populism of that period, is that it conceived of politics too much in the, um, you know, relation between a sort of the supposition of a kind of abstract political option, you know?
Mm,
Okay, there's Corbyn, there's Sanders, right? These sort of candidates who were parachuted in, right, to
right.
oppose the status quo. And the theoretical notion, right, that because there's this crisis of capitalism, right, because the relative purchasing power of workers has declined, or the middle class is waning or whatever, that people would be driven, you know, uh, by way of a sort of automata to support that.
Mm, yeah.
Right. And of course, what's lost in that, right, is the actual work, right? A lot of the actual work of actually building organizations, right, of making connections with people, right? Of the sort of painstaking and incremental work of kind of ideological inculcation, and all of that. And there are plenty of reasons why that didn't happen. I don't wish to blame the victim completely, so to speak.
Hmm.
But I think that what we saw at times with economic populism was sort of too abstract and theoretical a model of how political society functions.
Yeah, it's
Um,
really good. And it's sort of, is it not related to the errors of certain Marxisms that Losurdo has continuously criticized as almost like this kind of like theory of historical repetition that typically emerges at a moment when the class struggle becomes hot, when it becomes overdetermined? You have emerged what Losurdo calls the binary class theory. And you could say that the problem of post 2008 populism is precisely what Conrad is saying, which is that post 2008 populism, in all of its different forms, has not, what we love to say on the contemporary left, done the work. It sort of mistakes the appearance for the thing itself, right? And so that, but that itself is related to the other problem that Losurdo mentions rightly, which is the the visible and palpable reemergence of the class of the working poor, resembling something like the 19th century proletariat. Let's be honest. Um, and maybe even here we could talk about and debate the immiseration thesis, although it's very hard to talk about the immiseration thesis as we did in the 20th century, um, because even the because well precisely because the problem of the working poor um, still tends to be one in which their general social existence has overcome the crisis of like subsistence and hunger and things like that. So, as Bifo, Franco Berardi always says, alienation in like contemporary post 2008 capitalism is almost worse than historical worker alienation, precisely because of that fact, because the alienation that's experienced of the working poor is like atomized and unorganized, but also within the court of public opinion, it's not a permissible site for a subjective demand for overcoming that immiseration, right? If we agree that it is immiseration. So it's like the workers' movement has to be organized before we can even get to the binary class logic. Because remember, for Marx and Engels, every time they reverted to the binary class logic for how they understood the class struggle, Losurdo pointed to what you might call this faulty model, which ends up fetishizing class as this Lukácsian unity of subject object, or this Lukácsian class as for itself, right? Which I think is interesting because it really shows that Losurdo, in his notion of multiplicity of struggles, is very much opposed to that Lukácsian movement. Now, the reason that he's opposed to it tends also to be his understanding, which is a Leninist understanding regarding this delicate problem we talked about last time of what the outcome, right? Since we have had a history, which we often forget, of proletarian revolutions, that themselves are then tempted with A, building the productive forces, and B, participating or not participating in the perpetuation of imperialism, right? So you see the point, right? Which is that the more you fetishize that two-class theory, the more you reproduce, or possibly reproduce, capitalism, right? Julie, please come in.
Well, I wanted to talk about something I've been thinking about all day with regard to struggles for recognition and the class struggle. It occurred to me that now that we are in the Trump era, people are going to have to make decisions, and organizations are going to have to make decisions about resources, because we have LGBTQ rights under attack. We have immigrants' rights under attack. We have reproductive rights under attack. And I think there's going to be a lot of tension on the left when decisions have to be made about which one of those that we tackle at what time. And I'm praying that we can walk and chew gum.
That's really good, Julie. Thank you so much. I suppose my challenge with that, Julie, revolves around what I said at the beginning, which is a kind of sense or a question regarding the inertia of liberal institutions and the fact that they have like a dereliction on their democratic buy-in, and therefore there's a dereliction on their efficacy to enforce their missions. So you can almost say that like the whole civil society apparatus in America today has completely severed its trust with the population at a moment at which it really needs that trust in order to protect the types of subjectivities that need protection, right? So it's very tragic. I think we should ask ourselves, why has it gotten to this condition? Why is there such a profound trust barrier with these civil society groups? And it's also, frankly, why, Julie, so many socialists are talking about building civil society and the necessity of that, because the liberals have seemingly failed to do that. Matilda.
One of the things that popped out to me was his mention about like people and sometimes populism seeing civil society as some sort of like pure ground. And it seems like some people who read Hegel and who read Marx and then read Hegel are like become kind of civil society pilled or something. It's almost like I've seen some Marxists who read Hegel and are like turn into states' rights types of people and want the government out of like education and out of like everything, you know? It's kind of this like libertarian Marxism. And in reading Losurdo, it seems like you glean kind of criticisms of those sorts of things. It's almost like the spectrum is like people who are like maybe like Gerald Horne versus Sublation Media or something, where you have like, I don't know, distrust towards each other on the left, but it's kind of centered around the question of civil society. And so it's interesting seeing a reader of Hegel like Losurdo, who mentions like that can be a tendency of populism, and that like he brings up his question about the state and whether it can wither away in kind of a similar moment. And
Right.
I found that interesting. And
Yeah.
just to finish, like it seemed like the whole Trump inauguration speech was like a lot more like refined and kind of classically tuned than I expected. I kind of expected like outrage the entire time,
Right.
but it did seem like he was appealing to like the golden age and um kind of like classical conceptions of American society and manifest destiny. And it seemed like he was trying to appropriate some sort of national unification and like kind of an energy around sovereignty and like some sort of national movement,
Mm.
but paired with seemingly kind of a menacing policy towards external relations. Like I got the sense, and I think the Greenland thing and the Panama thing, like those things to me are like the Greenland thing is like resources in the Arctic and like Arctic navigation. Like that seems like a long-term concern of the military. Um, and it did seem like he I mean he said he wanted to plant the American flag on Mars, so there's like now like a race to plant a flag to like
Yeah.
um so it seemed like the most menacing parts of the inauguration speech were towards external, like people external to the United States. Like it gave like very much like imperialism. The domestic people will benefit from this if you stay in line and loyal. And it did seem more classical than I expected.
Thank you, Matilda. That's really insightful. I mean, it's interesting on Losurdo's. I have a review coming out soon on Losurdo's Hegel book. It's not so easy to call his position a support of Hegel's philosophy of right. It's rather um I think better understood as a return to Friedrich Engels's understanding and criticism of um, extracting that distinction that Engels makes between Hegel's method and his system. And so, what Losurdo's entire reading of Hegel's political thought revolves around is following Hegel at the level of his system, not his method. And it's sort of working on a similar Straussian notion of exoteric and esoteric, because the whole first part of the book is about a theory of Hegel and self-censorship. So, for example, Hegel uh, makes a very delicate balance between natural law theory and social contract theory. But when Losurdo compares the notes of the that he would give to eventually make the text of the philosophy of right, Losurdo notices a very interesting omission from the main text, which only appeared in his lecture notes, and that was that Hegel argued against uh, any law that would punish someone for breaking the law. It's called Notrecht, for breaking the law, um, who themselves are experiencing hunger. And Hegel's very particular about this, and this is why he argued that Rousseau had grown to be eaten up by the reactionaries, and therefore social contract theory was inadequate. And so he tries to make this dialectical synthesis between it and natural law theory, and Losurdo gets into how he tries to achieve that. So his argument is much more nuanced than I think people give it credit. The other point I'll make, and then we'll immediately go to Arendt, is that Losurdo's support for Hegel revolves around the maxim of the real is actual, the actual is real, which is the kind of highest insight of the philosophy of right. And here he provides a very helpful Marxist genealogy from Lenin, Gramsci, Engels and Marx, etc., who all submitted to this notion, but did it on condition that they read Hegel vis-a-vis Engels' original distinction I just mentioned between method and system. In other words, you can fully have Hegel in this non-literalist way if you're capable of extracting these two parts of Hegel. I'm not giving the full argument justice, but that's a kind of overview of it. But you'll see in my review, it's very, I think, very good. Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, I was just going to say a few things about the populism section, because I found it pretty stimulating and interesting. And to your point, Daniel, about his using it kind of overly broadly, I think that's just characteristic of the term, frankly. The term is always in all of the literature, whether it's in the kind of liberal literature or the kind of more ostensibly radical literature, the term is exceptionally broad and overused. And especially once it broke containment from the academy and became sort of in our like media life. I mean, so I think that's the context that Losurdo is kind of invoking the term, is it's already a field that's incredibly kind of broad and purposely so. To your point about his specific usage of it, though, and how you think that his kind of critique of utopian socialism or messianism are these things that pop up throughout all of his work, he kind of fits them into this receptacle of populism. I think a testament to that that's really interesting is that he uses this word transfiguration. I think that if we could sum up what he's saying in that chapter, it's that for him, it's populism as transfiguration of the past, what he calls like original fullness, and then of the presently kind of oppressed, and then women as a kind of third. He says that these are the three kind of transfigurations that he observes. But that's a specifically religiously coded term, obviously. The transfiguration it has a biblical occurrence. Essentially, in the Gospels, Jesus, his divinity appears to several of his disciples as they're praying. His physical appearance changes, and it's clear that he has divinity, even though he's been his appearance has been as a kind of peasant servant, all of this sort of thing. And he tells his disciples actually to sort of hide it until the resurrection and all of these things. But the point that I think that Losurdo is trying to make is he's trying to frame populism as inherently conservative. And the reason for it is specifically in that terminology of transfiguration, because Jesus's divinity is immanent, it's inherent in his being, and it can only present itself. In other words, there's not a historical horizon. There's not a kind of revolutionary nature in which his divinity can change. It's always immanent within himself, and it's simply within himself, and it can only present itself. And so I think that's really important, because if we bring it to the modern sense, I mean, I think that what Losurdo would say to those populist movements that you invoke, Daniel, is that the same sort of thing is occurring. So the instances he gives, but if you look at kind of the left populists, which is really what Losurdo is essentially concerned with here, not really right-wing populists, there's a conservatism insofar as they take the kind of various identities as fixed almost. You have an indigenous identity, you have an identity as an LGBTQ person, you have an identity as a woman, et cetera, et cetera. And the populist project is sort of what Chantal Mouffe calls the kind of linking of the various democratic struggles. So all you can do is sort of link these things together into a kind of stronger chain, but there's not a historical horizon. There's not a revolutionary horizon. You essentially have these prefixed identities, and it lends itself, and that's why I think it lends itself to a kind of messianism. I think that's, and a utopianism. That's why I think Losurdo wants to fit those things into his sort of typology of populism, is because the kind of potential for change is imminent within these identities themselves.
Yeah.
All right. It eschews a kind of consciousness and organization, which I think is characteristic of populism. It was self-consciously not organized. Sometimes this was called leaderless organization. Jean-Luc Mélenchon calls it his party is I think he calls it I think the English would be gaseous, is how he characterizes his party. And so I think that is what is really interesting for me in Losurdo's characterization, is that he's presenting populism as inherently conservative, which it is. And it is kind of a receptacle for all of these things that he already wants to critique. But I think that it's a useful one for that specific reason, which is that it eschews a kind of historical horizon. And I think that's, or it doesn't eschew it, it takes it as almost inevitable in many cases. It takes out the challenging work of actually sort of like raising class consciousness, for instance, organization. All of these things can be set to the side, because what really matters is the kind of immanence of these identities, which themselves have kind of revolutionary potential. And so all that you have to do is kind of collect these things. I don't know if that really makes sense.
No, I mean, but you can see it does make sense. It's really good. Thank you for that, Aaron. It does make sense though, because there's a kind of confluence, right? You have like three elements, right? You have the intensification of an ideological shift within the intellectual intelligentsia in the West, away from the historical tradition, both of Marxism as well as like the broader liberal revolutionary tradition itself, right? Because the two are, and Isabel Garro and Losurdo are both very good on this. For Marx, and this is like, say, Garros and Losurdo's, albeit slightly differently, but they both criticize Alain Badiou for this precise reason, which is that because of Badiou's postmodernist, although I shouldn't use that term, but because of his weird historicism, he doesn't think a dialectical mediation between liberalism and the revolutionary tradition. And the weird consequence, I think, is that like liberalism goes on automatic overdrive or automatic pilot, and that becomes a super big problem for resurrecting a serious class struggle based form of politics. And I think the other point that you made is super sound. What is it that Losurdo calls it? This idea of populism as relying on an original fullness of the human, whereby it's like it may appear to have a theory of social subjectivity that is open to a multiplicity, like you see in Laclau and Mouffe, and their notion of what they call equivalential chain, where you kind of say, okay, well, social struggle now is understood in this broad horizontalist way, where it can include this panoply of all of these different types of isms and different forms of struggle. And the task of the populist is to sort of identify the hegemonic nodal point that would unite them all, right? That kind of like Robert the Bruce in the Braveheart, like unite the clans. That's kind of Laclau and Mouffe, right? And I think the error of that, at least for Laclau and Mouffe in their version of populism, is that it's not grounded on the contradiction which is actually exterior to the subjectivities, which is the contradiction between capital and labor. And therefore it becomes highly opportunistic and fully mediated by the whims of discourse, which kind of goes back to Julie's point. And why the discourse, like, Engels had this idea in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, that there is, that socialism must set itself the task of ending the anarchy of production. I would say that the same goes, and there's a homologous anarchy of civil society. And that bourgeois civil society is that same kind of anarchic, reactive beast. And Hegel actually used the motif of the great beast to refer to civil society. He said civil society becomes like a great beast when its only source of mediation with itself is the market, which is an insight I get from Lukács and Kluskard in their reading of Hegel, because they both read Hegel and his comments on civil society as an imminent Marxist, as already possessing a very, very profound theory of political economy. Did you have a follow-up, Aaron, or should I go to Brendan?
No, I'm sorry. I need to figure out how to lower my hand.
Oh, no worries. Brendan, please.
Yeah, I was also kind of Julie has me thinking a little bit in terms of what the Sordo was talking about the fragmentation of class struggles and the kind of the dangers of the intensification of that fragmentation under the increased pressure of Trump. And I mean, like, I'm in Canada, so I'm not facing the Trump era quite in the same way, but I think that Canada is more than likely heading to a similar direction, as the political center of Canadian politics is kind of collapsing at the moment, and it's the right wing that's ascendant. So I'm thinking in very similar terms, where I'm anticipating a sort of intensification of the pressure that social movements face, and thinking a lot about experiences I've had even in what feel now like, I mean, 6 years ago feels a time like it was less a time of crisis than it is right now. And it's still, there was that sort of that like the pressure felt very intense. And um, I think I have a lot of memories of working, like whether it's in the climate movement or even in anti-austerity movements, where of trying to work in coalitions to bring like trade unions, which in Canada tend to be very much in the public sector, and so there can be there's a hesitancy at sometimes to really frontally challenge the government and to be really confrontational when they know that they're going to be in direct negotiations with, that's effectively their employer. And it's led to a sort of nihilism from a lot of people in these social movements about why do you keep feeling it's so important to keep going to the unions? Like, why do we need to get the unions on side? Like, what do? They kind of tend to be more conservative than like grassroots movements that don't really have the same sort of institutional interests. And I think like I bring this up just because I think Losurdo's framework of thinking about the kind of the fragmentation of class struggles and the way that the ruling class will attempt to foment that at all times, and that any form of class struggle really is susceptible to being swept up by that fragmentation of struggle. I think that's something I'll really be taking forward with me from this book, is that this is something that's quite constant, because I think to me when I was confronted with that before I had this framework, I think I was sort of like, well, yeah, why are the unions doing this? I thought they would be, this is the organized proletariat. Like, why are they seemingly an obstacle right now to the progressive changes that would benefit the working class that we're working towards? And I think that this does help to think about that fragmentation of struggle. And I think to at least sort of like map the terrain of what's actually happening here and to be able to anticipate this fragmentation. And I think like, he doesn't give us, he doesn't give us an easy solution to what to do to this, but he does say on page 280, just at the beginning of section 4 of chapter 12, or sorry, on section um 280, sorry, page 281, he does say that, it's only in special circumstances, in the presence of compelling theoretical synthesis, or under the influence of major revolutions or mature revolutionary projects. I'm sorry to say, I'd love to know if any of my American comrades disagree. I don't think that really exists either in Canada or in the US, but only under the presence of compelling theoretical synthesis or the influence of major revolutions and major revolutionary projects can they be resolved or unified. Can these fragmented class struggles be resolved or unified? And even then, not without oscillations and difficulties of various kinds. So I think, yeah, I appreciate that point, Julie. I think especially like bringing it just to like there are like reasons, there are kind of, it feels like a lot of people are going to be feeling like we do have to make choices of either or. We focus on either this or either that, because there is the like most of these organizations that, at least that I've worked with, are pretty pressed for resources as it is. But I think that while I don't think, again, I'm, please tell anyone, I'd love to be corrected, but I wouldn't say that a major sophisticated revolutionary project exists really in the US or Canada. I think it's that where we, I think, have some control is on that theoretical synthesis that Losurdo speaks to. I kind of feel like that's where we come in, as communists who are meant to unite, where we unite where other movements might be thinking in kind of more narrow terms. I think the burden is kind of on us to be laying out how the achievement of this or that social movement's narrow goals are inherently connected with are sort of grounded in a multiplicity of struggles, and that we can't opt out of that, really. Like, we opt out of that at our own peril. So those are just some I don't envy you in the
That's
US.
really good. It's really good because there's a certain sense in which it becomes like a fait accompli when you say that the welfare state was enacted through the mechanism of economic redistribution. You you perform that same ahistoricism that Habermas does. And then what you do is you kill the memory of the struggles that preceded the welfare state, which I find interesting. Like, for example, a lot of our comrades on the family abolition front, if you actually read Sophie Lewis's book on family abolition, what she's pulling from is a radicalization of Black feminists from the 60s and 70s about extending welfare rights. And that was the basis of my kind of criticism of her work, actually, because on that grounds, it's actually technically not really like a Marxist proposal in a certain way. So, like, because it's actually about a radicalization of the welfare state at the level of, you see, because the problem with the whole framework is that it shatters the consciousness of class or class interest, right? Why? Because if it's all distribution, then that means that we have a paternalism with the state. There's no independence. Conrad.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting what you're saying because one of the things you can detect within our discourse is a kind of symmetry, between bourgeois discourses, and sort of tendentially ultra-left discourses. Platypus comes to mind here with respect to this, where you see that both sides are united in agreement in a sense that all of the achievements of state construction, right? And all of the forms of redistribution that enabled, were something that issued from on high, right? So they don't acknowledge the actual practical legacy of struggles, right? And in the case of, the ultra left, that's a way of discrediting this, right? Of saying that, this was never really in any way, shape, or form a consequence of authentic socialist struggles, right? Insofar as it was, they were misguided, right? That we need to be narrowly focused at the abolition of the state in that sense, right? And I'm going to return to that theme, but I just want to, touch on a few things people have been saying. So one thing Julie was saying, she was talking about, how organizations in the United States are going to have to be setting priorities, and that's not going to be easy. I think, one thing that's important to remember as well, is that, in a period, if significant austerity is imposed upon certain public institutions, cultural institutions, and so forth, they're also going to be imposing austerity at the level of hiring, right? Which is very, very significant. And I think this also is eligible in certain ways to strengthen the forms of opposition, which exist to what's been termed identity politics. Because I see that I think so much of it, in a way, has to do with, different issues. But I think one thing that's very important is the context of employment in our society, right? So we see this within academia, for example, where, you just have like a complete and radical discrepancy in many fields between, people seeking jobs and the number of positions which exist, right? So, at that level, it's like, well, how do you discriminate, right? Between candidates, right? Very often, like, people have accomplished approximately similar things, right? Like, what do you do, right? And of course, if for some reason you're like a star scholar, then, perhaps you'll be recognized for that, or appreciated by the academy in that way. But very often what you see is a tendency to say, well, like, if we have all these people applying and one is as good as the other, then why don't we work to try to make our faculty, more representative of the overall society, right? Even when that's not representative necessarily of the people who are applying, right? And the result of that, is that resentments are very easily engendered, right? Where it's like, oh, the problem of why I wasn't hired isn't that, I mean, the real problem and the macro problem in a sense is that there aren't enough jobs, right? But people will blame, quote, DEI, right? And by extension, minorities, right? And the politics which are supportive of that um, for these things, right? And I think with respect to what Mathilde was saying, um, Mathilde was talking about, um, you know, the way these discourses function. Like she mentioned some of the things that sublation and so forth. And I think again, a lot of um, the failure to get behind these issues stems from um, confronting these things at kind of the surface level, and finding that sort of objection in them, right? Oh, this is, a betrayal of the ethos of meritocracy, for example, in a situation like the one I just described, rather than looking at the overall economic picture, and seeing that so many of these conflicts, which are ignited around questions of identity, can be rooted in a larger understanding, of the structural and economic shifts within our society, which of course have to do with politics. Now, I think when it comes to, the question um, of populism, and I thought it was interesting that you were touching on this. I mean, I think that, and it relates to what I'm saying. You were talking about one of the things that was being discussed here was how, um, you could have this chaining together of groups, right? But the problem is that there wouldn't be a properly revolutionary horizon within the setup that's established. And I think it's really interesting here, because I think that if the only function of your populism is to remain, or perpetuate or perhaps radicalize certain aspects of the status quo, right, that needn't be an actual problem, right? So again, if we look at the right, I think that they've united a lot of different and diverse constituencies. Um, and, often the points that they found to unite them, are superficial and in a sense without a horizon, right? So very often I think they target the fissure that exists between, the way that liberals message and what they actually do when they're in power, right? And this is actually really interesting too, because in Canada, with Trudeau, sort of this woke liberal, they had a poll on Trudeau and they were asking people what they disliked about Trudeau because Trudeau's government was very popular before he stepped down. And, there were some people who said, oh, he's too woke, but the more common response was they were frustrated because he just didn't do anything, right? And I think this is very, very indicative in of itself because I don't think that the objection is necessarily to, the progressive transformation of reality, which can be very appreciated insofar as it translates into a mass base. It's to, when you loudly proclaim these principles on one hand, right, and then you fail to actually provide an economic basis or to really do anything on the other. So I think it's really interesting, for example, with feminism, right? Like it's like, because if you look at 1960 to 2000, there was this huge economic transformation, right? In terms of women's integration into the workforce, equal pay, and so forth, right? And that was to a large extent accepted and hegemonic in terms of, the way that it, year by year was sort of improving in that respect. And what we've seen since about 2000 is that this has stalled out, mostly because in my opinion, I think that that struggle reached the point where it would have had to have translated into a critique of unwaged socially reproductive labor within society in order to continue, right? In other words, you had within the context of women assuming a greater share of socially reproductive labor, they kind of maxed out within the labor force, right? But it's interesting because, the attacks on feminism have strengthened when actually less is being transformed, right? Because when a cause stagnates like that, and when you have these general conditions of inequality, which have been very characteristic of neoliberalism, right, it's very easy to present feminism as, e.g., a discourse of elites, right? People who preach at the superstructural level but aren't doing anything for actual people, right? A means for a privileged stratum of women to elevate themselves while conditions are not being improved for people at large. So I think that's a very important point to keep in mind. But all I meant to say here is that the left, I think unlike the right, the right kind of they're able to unite these coalitions around, often fairly superficial sources of opposition, and then to kind of keep capitalism going or intensify it in the background. I think that we're faced with a different task, which is that we have to present a genuinely revolutionary horizon. And that speaks to a different way in which populism, if you will, or if we're going to use that term, would have to function if it were going to be useful for us. Now, I'll shift finally and just say that I think this relates, this question of horizon, it kind of relates to, and you were talking about a little while ago, Daniel, you were talking about Losurdo's critique of Zizek. And if I understood you properly, part of Losurdo's critique of Zizek, which is not completely dissimilar from his critique of Althusser, in a sense, is that the idea of the real as a kind of imminent to the texture of the symbolic and the imaginary, loses sight of like this horizon, which is so significant, of emancipation, which is so significant
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah,
for
that's right.
socialism. Yeah,
Well, on the one hand, exactly. On the one hand, it's kind of calling Zizek's bluff,
yeah,
which is like, well, if if on the one hand, like contemporary liberal ideology is preventing um subjects, it's, whatever, this kind of like, and that's always vague because Zizek doesn't have a class analysis on the foundation of his theory of
yeah,
subjectivity. It's based on an abstract, ahistorical theory of alienation. That's
yeah,
actually why I wrote my article Althusser against Lacan, which is like
yeah,
what would that look like, right? Because I think um, that's one of the big, 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 big dangers of bringing Lacan and psychoanalysis into Marxism, because what you're doing is you're going back into the Marxist theory of alienation when you're doing that. And I think that there's a great danger to dehistoricize alienation in a certain way. But Zizek doesn't only do that, he proceeds on the basis of a dehistoricized theory of alienation and then proceeds to present a new version of Marxism that might be capable on psychological grounds or psychoanalytic grounds of somehow enacting political scenarios where we touch this disavowed
yeah,
ideological core, which is perverse, right? This is that whole like spectrum between perversity and the sublime in Zizek. And so it becomes a weird aesthetic messianism of the real that's dehistoricized because it also conceals a pessimism over emancipation, because certain forms of emancipation are done, according to Zizek, which is why Zizek, in a certain sense, thinks like he has a very anti-workerist position in his Marxism.
yeah,
But I think his anti-workerist position is based on a reading of Lacan that's idealist, which I've criticized
yeah.
about him. So I don't know if you had a follow through there.
Well, I do, and I think that, I guess to Zizek's credit, I'm not a Zizekian, but I guess to Zizek's credit, I think in Hegel and a Wired Brain, he talks about the different interpretations of kind of Marxian totality which have existed. It's a bit of like an ad hoc itinerary that he provides, but he talks about, totalization by the standpoint of the proletariat in Lukács. And then he talks about totalization via Western liberal democratic states in Fukuyama. And then he talks about totalization via singularity, like AI singularity. So
Yeah.
God is like AI, like Kurzweil, and so forth, and this kind of thing. But this does raise the question, like if you're going to maintain this sort of radical horizon of emancipation, you're left with the task of kind of producing a frame or context in which that would be realized. And I think part of the imminent crisis of class struggle as a book, because the book has its own crisis,
Yeah.
is that, and this explains, I think, some of Finelli's comments about the significance of the philosophy of right for um, Losurdo.
Right.
But the imminent crisis of it is that, like, he doesn't have firm confidence in the withering away of the state. Like we see this throughout this. Like he
Yeah,
raises
that's
it as a
true.
he raises
Well,
it as a
that's a good point.
he raises it as a question, right? And so what happens, is that, when it comes to, and I've mentioned this before, when it comes to the multiplicity of the struggles he discusses, right? The only way that he can kind of resolve those contradictions is through the appeal to the state. right? Which again risks being a little bit like, Hegel, the universal class is bureaucrats or something in the philosophy of right. And this also pushes him. I mean, it's part of it, but it's also why also then he gets in the situation where he's like, well, maybe the state won't go away, right? Because he's backed himself into a bit of a corner here, right? In terms of the role that the state is playing within his work. And I do have to say that reading his comments about the withering way of the state, I was a little bit, and I think this is why, and I'm not good, I don't agree with this sentiment, but I think this is why, someone like, what is his name? Somebody said the other day, people in Platypus, for example, say, well, Losurdo is not a Marxist, and he says it himself,
Right.
right? Now, I don't agree with that assessment, but I was still very surprised to see the degree to which he was backing off the withering way of the state because it's been such a fundamental component of how we've conceived Marxism. I mean, even the most ardent Marxist-Leninists, including in some way Lenin, right, in State and Revolution, right? The strategy has not been to deny that, right? It has been to defer that,
Yes.
right? So he goes even further, if you will, than that, and begins to question it altogether as a hypothesis. So that's what I
Yeah,
have to say there.
yeah. I mean, I suppose you could make the claim that internationalism remains a sort of horizon in which a futural homage to the withering of the state could be on the table on condition that um, we move to market socialism or something like if a socialist party is sort of victorious within the American system and begins to model its economy off of China, one could envision a Losurdian vision in which, okay, socialism is now hegemonic. Like now there has to be like a new. So there is a sense in which, because Losurdo is such an interesting and close reader of Marx and Engels, I'll remind you of the saga that we had, which spilled over to Twitter regarding Losurdo's uh, critique of socialist imperialism, even in Engels, especially in Engels, right, over Mexico, and the naivete that both Marx and Engels had, which I think is naive on their part, about how, yeah, we want, it was a well, in Losurdo's language, it was an accelerationism of the binary class logic in favor of the bourgeoisie to finish their revolutions, because pregnant within their rule is an unruly proletariat which is just ready to take them over, right? Um, we obviously cannot hold such fantasies now, but so anyways, however you assess Marx and Engels and their errors on that is up to you. But what I'm trying to say, I think, is that on Withering of the State, Losurdo's main point, Conrad, is that it is often brought into the strategy of the practice of Marxist and socialist struggle in moments in which it only ends up resulting in a kind of ultra leftism, maybe. Evie, please jump in.
Can I
Sorry to
just,
keep
I'm
you waiting.
sorry to jump the queue really quickly,
Please,
but
please.
I just wanted to say something really quickly on this because I like your very generous reading of it, but on page 338, he calls the withering, the expectation that the state will withering away. He says it's utterly unrealistic, which to me does not seem like he's couching it in a kind of strategic
Well, remember, no, wait,
logic, or
I'm referring to
you
the
see what I mean?
end. I'm referring to the end of Western Marxism. When he, remember, he has the four part and he lists it like 1, 2, 3, 4. And he does put like way off in the future. He does leave that open. But what I love about Losurdo is that, and maybe this is why proletarians like Losurdo, it's because he's fucking concerned about the goods, man. Like he's fucking concerned about winning. You know what I mean? Like he's concerned
Yeah.
about doing this shit. You know what I'm saying? So maybe you're right. I just wouldn't go too. I have some sympathies with what he's saying, I suppose. You could also say that Losurdo doesn't possess a theory of dictatorship of proletariat. And I think that also may be valid. Evie, sorry to keep you waiting, bro.
By the way, can I just add very quick,
Yes.
just to what you said about China you said about the US perhaps resembling the Chinese economy. This might be out of context in the sense that one could make a strong argument that in the context of demobilization, communist demobilization in China, that much of the justification for state ownership has been technocratic in the sense that it's a policy whereby they protect themselves, right, from being basically monopolized by foreign firms, right, that thereby extract rents. So, again, China has like many different political strands, but I think there are, powerful voices within China who would probably think that, well, if we weren't one-fifth, as wealthy as the US in GDP per capita, then maybe not necessary.
Well, I
Right.
mean,
So it's important to keep that in mind as well.
I think that's a really good point. I worry that Losurdo's introduction of the category of the political caste and his celebration of it. Remember that point from last time where he says, well, in reality, um, since the Jacobins, we haven't really had revolutions on behalf of a coherent class. It's been this like heterogeneous assemblage of like crazy intellectuals and like vanguards and whatnot. And that's what he calls a political caste. And then he says, but that can be then split between political castes that are Bonapartist or political castes that are proletarian, basically, or that work in the interest of the proletariat. They themselves obviously don't have to be proletarians. But then he says something even more interesting, which is that political caste will, after they are successful in a revolution, they will have to cooperate with the prior political caste. So, anyways, Evie.
Yeah, thanks. I'm gonna, I guess, go back a bit regarding like the multiplicity of struggles and like how to apply like a compelling theoretical synthesis that makes sense of like labor and like mass movements combining and working together. Um, and all in the context of like the monstrosity of civil society and like all of its like its multiplicity of tentacles, right? Um, and yeah, I guess it is going to take strong theoretical synthesis, but I think of it, it's like the science of interconnection, right? Like if the actual material relations that like make it necessary are made clear through like direct practical relationship building over time. And that's the thing, is over time. And how much time do we fucking have, but I'm directly like concerned with this because of the labor organizing that I'm doing in Virginia within like the rideshare driver movement. It's dominated in my state by a very civil society tentacle phenomenon. And it's been contentious, like struggling against it, and I tried to like start something from outside of it and do rank and file organizing, but they basically just overshadowed what I was doing because they had the long arm of capital, and so yeah, I'm just like butting up against what is, in labor organizing terms, is labor liberalism. But it has the effect of basically almost like authoritarian, and almost is just me. It is not almost. It's quite authoritarian, just like in its general like logics. It doesn't treat the workers, the drivers themselves like agents of change, if you will, right? Like the people who are like the subjects of the union, right? And so their like subjectivity is not being engaged, their creativity is not being engaged, their sense of urgency is not being engaged. They're like problem solving across the multiplicity of struggles is not being engaged, you know, because they're essentially being like held in check to be directed at legislative strategies. And so in order to silo people into the specific action you want them to perform, you have to erase the multiplicity of struggles and like crowd it out and not allow it and moderate the chat, you know. And it's just a few people who are paid staffers to that hold these positions. I might be saying too much. I don't know if anybody in Virginia is gonna,
Right.
you know, whatever, but it's they're trying their asses off in their own way, but because of their class position and because of their like allegiance to the people who pay them, they're like not allowed to have allegiance with us, the workers, you know. And so the struggle that I'm butting up against is like trying to create a culture that opposes it from within it, that is constructive and that isn't antagonistic, because
Mm.
their goal is to treat me like an agitator, right? Like I'm like, you know, trying to, he cautioned me against counter organizing the other day, because I'm like, hey, you know, let's do it this way. Give me some
Yeah.
time in the meeting. It's weird. It's a very so breaking through that civil society like logic in terms of the internal organizing structure is something that I'm having difficulty with as like the only individual that sees it like that, you know. And
Yeah.
so um yeah, I'm just trying to practice the science of interconnection and not like stop or give up, you know. And as they're failing, as the model that they're offering is not doing what it needs to do, there is an opening. There are openings like for the injection of like strong theoretical practice, you know. And that's
Yeah.
what we're lacking giving the workers. um and so yeah, just like that fragmentation um is what we're facing, is like what's being done to us, you know. And so the science of interconnection is you know, the prescription essentially, you know. um Check, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Evie. Thanks. And Julie, I invite you to jump in since you were mentioned and I saw you. Um, did you want to jump in, Julie, to what Evie said?
No, I need to collect my thoughts.
Okay. I just wanted to give you a chance. I thought you might. Yeah, I really appreciated that. It's, Jason Reed has this concept of negative solidarity, and it's pretty pernicious. The idea is that basically that neoliberalism creates an antisocial bond. So all of its raison d'etre, or its kind of core logic of civil society, is actually based on a bond that is that reinforces this like negative atomism, and therefore like solidarity is almost taken to be like cringe or impossible, or and I think that that itself presents a danger for Marxism, right? And I think this is why I've been such a, or try to be, I'm not claiming that I'm good at it, but I try to be, and I think we all should be, more strident critics of right-wing Marxism, which is so prominent these days, precisely in the sense that for them, um, to combat liberalism, we need to reify liberalism, or the liberalism of social society, in such a way that we um, almost like vulgarly take class categories and like force them as a sort of transitive truth for those subjects, right? So this results in this like monstrous situation where really what they mistake base for superstructure, these vulgar Marxists, where they end up basically saying that we are Marxists and we define class vis-a-vis base. But what they're really meaning by that is that they define class through liberal categories, because they mean by that, like, we define class through like the immediacy of one's occupation and income. A, and then B, we know that empirically, like we have knowledge of that epistemologically by the way people talk and the way they act. That is an inversion of liberalism. That is exactly the policing of the public sphere that liberalism prides itself on. Right-wing Marxism just inverts that. So it stays within liberalism, in my view. Brendan, go ahead.
Yeah, I had some thoughts on the question of the state that was raised here, and want to also, I guess, I don't know if defend. I don't know if anyone's attacking Losurdo's view on the state here, but I think I'm quite sympathetic to his view also, in that, like, I think two things. I guess, like, one of the things I heard was that the abolition of the state has always been, like, central to the Marxist canon, and for sure that's true, but I would not say that that's something that's been emphasized in all strands of Marxism in all places at all times, like, to the same extent. I think especially in the West, that is, like, that's a really core central tenet in Western Marxism that I think is valorized a lot more. Whereas in the East, to take the Western Eastern binary, like, socialism, where it's actually been realized, has been like a state building project against imperialism. And that being the case, I think that, like, to me, when I hear Losurdo say that it's not realistic, the abolition of the state, I take that to be kind of a grounded statement and not an absolute for all times statement. Where I think that he's completely right, that it's unrealistic for the foreseeable future, in my mind. Like, I think that, like, like, in my mind, like, I take Losurdo's view on the state to be pretty similar to Mao's statement in on the People's Democratic Dictatorship. He kind of polemically takes up this question of, like, do you want to abolish state power? And he says, yes, we do, but not right now. We cannot do it yet. Why? Because imperialism still exists, because domestic reaction still exists, because classes still exist in our country. And so our task is to strengthen the people's state apparatus. And I think this can maybe, like, dovetail a little bit into, I would like to talk a little bit about Losurdo's takes on modern China, because I think that view is really quite, is kind of valid, um has aged quite well. Like, I think that Losurdo highlights that, like, China's kind of leading role from 1949 in bringing about the end of the Columbian era, and it's really hard to overstate the historical significance of that, and the progressive historical development that represents from a class struggle perspective, and the possibilities that it's opened up for working classes and oppressed nations across the world. Like, it's because it's not there's problems with it, but those kind of macro level developments, I think, are underappreciated on the Western left, and I think Losurdo does a really good job of bringing those out. And I think especially when he talks about, we haven't talked too much about the way that he sort of, like, Losurdo, we talked earlier in the book a lot about how he talks about, like, struggles for national liberation, for women's liberation, and of course, like, the struggle of wage laborers as, like, these different forms of class struggle. But really, he does position development against imperialism as a form of class struggle. And speaks
Yes.
that, in this chapter, he speaks a lot about the kind of the problem of achieving political independence while remaining economically dependent, and the way that this will eventually lead to the rolling back of any semblance of political independence. And I think, again, the example of China, like, it's the achievements there are too important to ignore. For all the problems that exist with contemporary China, it's not a neocolony, and it's not heading towards being a neocolony, and it's enabling space for other countries that want to resist being neocolonies that did not exist for the past 30 years, especially since the decline of the USSR. So I would love to hear others thoughts on this. I think the one last thing I do want to just mention that I thought was another point that he made that will really stick with me in terms of how to engage particularly Westerners on China today, and its role in the world, and kind of where it's at in terms of class struggle. Because we often get the sort of, like, I think when people think of China, we see them focus on, like, the one type. In the West, there's a real fixation on there's a determination not to take the two types of inequality that Losurdo talks about very seriously. There's the inequality that exists internally to a country, and then the inequality that exists at the international level. And I think that it's that first type of inequality that tends to be the focus of most discourse in the West. And that includes in China. So when I'm engaging a lot of people on China, what I hear oftentimes is you hear about the inequality, you hear about the poor working conditions and these sorts of things. And so a lot of the time when I'm dealing with critics of China, what I'm kind of confronted with is the idea that they just suppress their own working class and that the bourgeoisie in China is ascendant. But I think Losurdo resists even allowing that framing for quite a while, but eventually he does deal with that a little bit. And I think that he has a quote on page 300. Again, towards the end of his discussion, he says that we may draw a conclusion if we wish to understand the terms of the class struggle in China correctly, we must bear in mind the role of the Western and especially the US bourgeoisie. Its offensive is not restricted to the state sector of the economy and more generally, the leadership role of political power in the economy. It is a political, ideological offensive that seeks to demonize Mao on the basis of an absolutization and decontextualization of his happiest years in power. I think that's true, and his defense of Mao is very useful. I think it still needs to be understood today that there's a determination to cast the US-China conflict, I think, as an issue of generic inter-capitalist competition. And I would argue that it still is a conflict between two different modes of production, right? And that the attack on the state sector from the Western bourgeoisies, that is because this is a different mode of production that threatens capitalism. The last thing I'll say just to illustrate that point is because a lot of my research focuses on Canada-China relations, and studying the position of the Canadian bourgeoisie on China is quite interesting because it's struck by a sort of contradiction in the discourse that exists also in the US, where the continued importance of the state sector of the economy and state-owned enterprises is cast on the one hand as an economically inefficient, like a poor economic system, and at the same time a competitive threat that is too serious, that is unfair to competition for Western companies because Chinese companies have state backing. And I think that's a kind of class position that we need to struggle with also, because it just on the one hand, it can't be that it's both economically inefficient and it's a competitive threat to apparently a more efficient economic system. But what they mean, of course, is that it's unfair competition to individual Western enterprises which don't benefit from that state backing. But I think that then the question that needs to be raised when communists are discussing, I think, China is what stake does the working class have in fair competition for this or that Western company if you're kind of conceding that the entire system itself can't compete with the Chinese system, which places where the political is still kind of dominant.
Wow. I love this study group. People bring such rich and in-depth things to bear. Thank you guys so much. I really like that point you made on page 300 that you referenced about Mao, because it is really about a kind of multiple decades long propaganda campaign regarding the legacy of the communist project in China. And with the TikTok ban and the new brazen imperialist positioning, Trump may be some paradoxical anti-imperialist in this right populist way, but not when it comes to China, right? So that's something we can probably guarantee. And I feel like that itself also lends itself to civil society conversation, in the sense that some some inadequacies of Western Marxism and their views, their rejection of China as either from Adorno or Zizek, as possessing nothing emancipatory or just purely equivalent to the capitalist system. It's that kind of like that to me typifies a kind of like perfunctory 68 thought. You know what I mean? Like it's just so maddening. Sorry, Matilda, go, please. And I'll be right back.
I'm thinking about the overall thing here and some of everyone's points, but it does seem like he wants, like, it does seem like an overall, like, overarching concern of this book is like the general theory of like a general social theory, and like kind of one of the reoccurring themes is like what happened to the class struggle after the World War II or something. And it's kind of like trying to reclaim Marxism as a form of like historical investigation and knowledge, because it seems like to him it's quite common to think that like whatever Marx predicted of class struggles like didn't pan out after the 40s, and it's like kind of confusing to a lot of people to like how to read history and to understand it. And it does seem like this question of the international division of labor does like a lot of work for him to reclaim a historical knowledge deriving from Marxism. And I think he's pretty persuasive when he like brings up like Marx and Engels' support during the Civil War as like kind of this paradigm of like state-sponsored or like class struggle at the helm of power, and like alongside that, like the political expropriation of the state versus the economic in the USSR and China, and how it does seem like and still in China, that there is the ability for disciplining the bourgeoisie by the political apparatus. And it seems like one of the most glaring gaps in Trump's inaugural address was like disciplining CEOs, you know, like that was like a huge media thing with the healthcare CEO assassination, is like people demanding the ability of the state to discipline the bourgeoisie or the economic class, which the US seems incapable of. And it seems like one of the things that China is capable of, and I think is a strength for it and general and gaining general appeal. But yeah, the emphasis on the international division of labor and how the Western capitalist metropoles set up being first, you know, this is kind of the thesis of Western Marxism, how it kind of got baked in that there is this like unequal international division of labor coming from like the classical centers of imperialism in Europe, and that this order, the Columbian order, is coming to an end, and that national liberation struggles and women's struggles and class struggles all find a relation in this division of labor. And it's interesting that in Marxism, kind of like the orthodox Marxism, the only way to like deal with the division of labor is to socialize the means of exchange. And like that's like the whole story of the withering away of the state and the planning of the economy by civil society eventually. But it seems like he's able to find modes whereby this division of labor is in some ways socialized or given the dignifying of workers, seems like it has an effect on this division of labor in a certain way. Yeah, something like that.
No, I know that's an extremely important point, Matilda, and I thank you for raising that. I know you've raised that, the centrality of the division of labor in Losurdo's wider theory of class struggle. I think it's almost like the centrifugal point, which connects the multiplicity of struggles, because it exists. It exists, you know, across different core periphery dynamics. It also reappears internal to class struggles that don't take on a particularly capitalist form, right? So therefore it's also incorporates this question of like a the Hegel of Losurdo being a Hegel of some type of like proper attentiveness to this social reality of the division of labor across the multiplicity of struggles. And so that's why you get in Losurdo very much like this political epistemological Hegel, which links him to Lukács, because that is also the Hegel of Lukács, right? Which is like, unlike Althusser, I think, for Lukács, there is no real strong break with Hegel. If anything, the break with Hegel that occurs in 1845 with the thesis on Feuerbach is a break that immanentizes Hegel's dialectic and brings it into the class struggle as a means for the working class to develop a collective grasp on social reality, which would be different and antagonistic to the social reality of the bourgeois public sphere and civil society. You need Hegel for that mediation process, which is like a, you know, which I've always found very beautiful and very, very, very revolutionary. Conrad, please.
Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to respond to what you were saying about right-wing varieties of communism. And I take it you're talking a little bit about sort of like the kind of infrared sort of ACP kind of axis in that way. And there was something that I thought was so funny and maybe indicative, was that there was a guy I was debating, you know, in Simulation Socialists, which I play a role in. And uh, he was, you know, he got to sort of a heated point in the debate, and he said, you know, McCarthyist America, it persuaded Americans that communism is anti-white, anti-male, anti-family, and I think he said anti-religion or something like that. Um, you know, and then he said, you know, you trots out there, not a Trotskyist, but this was, you trots out there are out proving them right. You know, we don't want
Right.
to do that.
Right.
Right. And to me, this is like, this is so indicative, because it's like you take, you know, that kind of extreme propaganda, which is lobbed, right? You know, and rather than, you know, faced with that onslaught, rather than responding to it in a coherent way, right? Rather than reaffirming, right, the fundamental bona fides of Marxism, right? What we have is an internalization of that standpoint and that critique, so that let's not be that, right? So what are we going to be? We're going to be pro-male, pro-family, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I see
Pro-religion,
what you mean. Yeah.
right? We're going to be, you know, and it's like, what could go wrong from a Marxist standpoint with this
That's why
equation?
I said that's why I said dialectically it is like caught in some unity of opposites logic with liberalism itself. Um and so, you know, it's frustrating, but how do we correct it? You know, how do we, because this is going to be an issue, and I think it's only going to get worse in the Trump era
Well, I
because of
think,
the anarchy of the bourgeois liberal public spheres. It's not going to calm down. I mean, you know, it's not going to become a site where like a new way can be forged. I think people are probably going to likely double down on old tactics.
well, we need actually parties and organizations to educate people in these things, right? And it's like, even if you look, if you look at the tremendous richness of, Italian and French Marxist theory, for example, which was mirrored by a fairly active praxis, even as it may not have been as revolutionary as some would have liked, right? Compared to a lot of Western countries, let's say. Um, you know, that was a consequence of also, in a sort of pre-internet era, the capacity of parties and organizations to educate people in these topics, right? And to provide the sort of integrals of Marxism to them. And absent that in the United States, you know, um, you see what you get, which is on one hand, you get like a kind of liberal Marxism, right? That, tails identity politics, right? And tails cancel culture, right? And becomes a kind of really meek reformism in the end, right? And on the other hand, you see what really isn't, I don't even think the primary contradiction, because, mostly it's just something which is prevalent within certain internet spaces, but you also see, as you said, like a kind of right-wing Marxism that goes kind of in the other direction, right? Tailing the far right in that way in terms of its views. So the point is the whole politics, right? These bourgeois binary, right, becomes restated, right, within Marxist discourse, right, which really just speaks to the impotence or incapacity, right, to develop like an authentic standpoint through which to assess reality. And I think that really speaks to the situation we're in. Now about China and Losurdo, because I'm not I'm not an expert on China, but I know a few things about China. I live in China, so I might be able to offer something. Um, I think it's important to remember like about this stuff about the state. It's like so, obviously, um, you know, the role of the state can be significant, within, and has been very significant for sort of non-Western projects, starting with at the most basic level, as a means of organizing production internally, right? Rather than being in a situation where it's Western firms coming in and either colonizing or sort of neo-colonizing, right? So they extract profits in that way, which is often, resorted to as kind of a quick fix, right? Like if you don't have the apparatus to do that. But of course, like if a foreign enterprise comes in, right, and it quote invests, right, the problem is you're going to be paying out to them, right, in a way you obviously wouldn't if you did it yourself. So like at the most basic level, we can observe that. At the same time, if we look at the history of struggle in China, it did not begin as like a pro-state, um, a valorization of the state in that way. Now, we can say, okay, well, in some sense, you know, the Communist Party in China was already conditioned by the failure of world revolution, right? So they probably weren't as dizzyingly optimistic, about the abolition of the state on a global level as people might have been in 1917, and that may be true. But if you look at Mao's earliest writings, and Mao, of course, didn't have he couldn't read a lot of what Marx wrote because he only read in Chinese, I believe. So actually a lot of what he ended up reading was like Kropotkin and just like whatever was kind of around. He read a lot of anarchist things, whatever was kind of around, in Chinese. If you look at Mao's first sort of major text, right, on the peasant movement in Hunan, right, it's really this sort of overwhelming celebration, right, or valorization of the organic capacity of peasants, right, to resist, right, landlords, to challenge gender roles, and so on and so forth, right? And it's on this basis that he imagines that the Communist Party can be a useful vehicle for the organization of peasants, right? Outside the city, right? And so this is taking him, you know, somewhat beyond the frame, certainly of what had been the tendency to present a sort of bureaucratized socialism or socialism in one country, in the Stalinist, with Stalin's ascension. Now, we see repeatedly, and I will mention here, by the way, that in 1936, 37, I think in the original constitution of the Chinese Communist Party, they also allowed, like in the USSR, the territories were originally allotted the right to succeed. And that was removed when they took power in 1949. But if you look after 49, right, Mao's entire time in power, right, or not entire time, but very significant throughout the time he was in power, was the resistance towards state hegemony, right? So both the Great Leap Forward and even more emphatically, right, the Cultural Revolution were an attempt to resist the top-down domination of the state, right? You know, in the Cultural Revolution, it was extremely explicit, right? There is an internal bourgeoisie crystallizing within the state itself. We have to mobilize people, right, in order to resist it, right, to encourage mass forms of praxis, which are precisely anti-state in that sense, right? Now that failed, right? And it didn't congeal into new institutions, right? And as a result of that, you had, you know, a kind of retrenchment, you know, of the state on one hand, but also on the other hand, you know, as a kind of substitute for the incapacity of organic mass praxis to congeal into something new, you had the market emerging. And in a way that was necessary because the state was so destroyed after, you know, the bureaucracy was so decimated, right? So that was the solution that was turned to. So I want to be clear, and I think it's important to understand this. Like, you know, it's one thing to acknowledge that the state, you know, has played a vital strategic role, you know, in the formation and success of these projects, and I think that's very important. And I think Losurdo is his absolute strongest, right? When he is criticizing, right, Western Marxists who ignore this, right, who immediately go toward a kind of, you know, libertarian vertigo, right, you know, according to which, you know, it'd be unacceptable in any way, shape, or form, right, to utilize these mediating forms. But I also want to be clear that, you know, it's not as like, even for China to get in a position, right, like for the state to have the power that it did, right, was ultimately a consequence of mass struggle, right, that was not explicitly conceived in some kind of statist vein, right, you know, or simply as a means of constructing, you know, sort of massively powerful state in that way. So at that state, you know, and even if you're completely uncritical of the state, it would be useful to acknowledge that that was not strategically useful at that point, right? Like Mao had to marshal peasants, right? You know, he wasn't going up to them and being like, "Oh, well, you guys are going to be under the thumb of like a highly centralized bureaucratic rule," right? That wasn't how that appeal was made, right? Now, as regards the question of China in the Deng period and beyond, someone here mentioned, I think Brendan mentioned the question of mode of production in relation to China. So this is very interesting. Like, you know, at the level of the means of production, you could say that, you know, China, in some sense, may be qualitatively different than Western economies, right? Because the means of production are putatively publicly held, right? Of course, one might question the exact meaning of that in a context where, you know, democracy and consultation are not necessarily so widespread. Nevertheless, if you accept this notion, then you could argue that. Of course, we might also have to ask then, like, is post-war France a different mode of production? You know, I have some time for that. You know, I speak metaphorically. You know, that's maybe an interesting query, but you could argue it on that basis because of the difference in the ownership and the means of production. But I think, you know, very important here is to understand that one thing I would insist upon is I think that relations of production in China are very strongly capitalist, right? So like, in other words, even if you're in, you know, you're working in a public firm, okay, well, you're gonna have more guarantees, right, than you would in the private sector, sure. But the way that things are managed, right, you know, is symmetrical with the structure of the private sector in general. And that much more so than in the USSR. Well, why? Right, you might ask. Part of that is because if you, you know, the insecurities, right, that come with the existence of the private sector, you know, and the liberty it has to fire people at will, for example, and the precarity that it imposes, you know, they function as a way of generalizing capitalist relations of production throughout China. Because even if there exists substantial public firms, right, as in Western examples, right? People don't have these absolute social guarantees, right? And they're still functioning within this kind of logic in which, well, you can be precarized, it's possible to lose your job, right? You can be now if you have a public economy, right? Where, that's geared towards a kind of long-term reproduction and where the guarantees are very thorough, right? That's a very different thing. So even if you look at China in like the 70s, I think Losurdo actually mentions this in his book on Stalin, but there were people who like wouldn't go to work for like 2 weeks because their wife was sick, or would like not show up for 2 years and continue to be paid, right? So this is the thing, right? Like when you have an economy that's comprehensively public and not beholden to private sector imperatives like that, you actually get a different set of relations of production which can ensue, right? But when you have an economy in which the private sector is very, very large, about half the Chinese economy, and when you don't have that level of security, right, and when it's guided by private sector imperatives, right, then relations of production can conform to a sort of capitalist level. Now, are means of production or relations of production more important? I mean, traditionally within Marxism, I guess we would say means of production, but it's also something of a heated debate, right? If you read someone like Cohen, right, in his sort of posture of being, the kind of ultra-orthodox analytical Marxist, right? He will say means of production are more important. Althusser, on the other hand, right, will say that relations of production are more important, right? So that itself opens us up to a significant debate with respect to that, but I'll just leave it there.
Amazing. I think I want to close unless folks wish to jump in, from Julie to Sasha to Jaira to Michael, Benji. Folks haven't anything y'all want to contribute or jump in on, please feel free to do so. Or forever hold your peace. No, it's been a good session, guys. I'll let you all know what's next. I have several thoughts planned for new study ventures that we can engage in and projects that I'm excited to share with folks. I have to close now in part because I'm having to be called in to deal with this ridiculous, hopeful dissolution of the American Communist Party. It's a long story, but it is what it is. And so I think we'll break unless anybody has any thoughts. I'll just stop the record for now.